5:15 in the morning, the South China Sea, 200 miles west of the Luzon Strait. The E-2 Delta Hawkeye, callsign Vanguard, held a steady orbit at 30,000 feet while its crew monitored a series of intermittent radar returns that should not have been there. These were not the slow, predictable tracks of commercial airliners or the familiar signatures of regional patrols. They were ghost echoes, flickering on and off. The ANAPY-9 radar screen like heat haze, moving at 1,200 kilometers per hour. The humid morning air inside the fuselage was thick, with the scent of ozone and the low, mechanical hum of the tactical data link. Below the aircraft, the USS Abraham Lincoln cut a bacon-scent, sharp white scar through the glass-smooth surface of the dark water, her 4 massive propellers pushing 100,000 tons of steel toward the heart of the disputed waters. The mission was supposed to be a standard freedom of navigation exercise, a demonstration of presence in a contested corridor. But as the sun began to bleed a pale, sickly yellow across the eastern horizon, the tactical situation shifted from routine to critical in less than 90 seconds. The Hawkeye mission commander watched as the intermittent returns stabilized into 14 distinct tracks, flying in a coordinated sweep and clear formation. These were J-20 stealth fighters of the People's Liberation Army Air Force, and they were flying a direct intercept course for the carrier. Strike Group. 2 decks below the flight deck of the USS Abraham Lincoln, the pilots of Carrier Air Wing 9 were already sitting in their 40 cockpits. The Ready 5 alert status meant their engines were primed and their inertial navigation systems were aligned. When the alarm finally shattered, silence of the pre-dawn air, it was not a drill. It was a high-pitched, rhythmic wail that signaled an immediate scramble. The deck became a frantic ballet of colored jerseys. Yellow shirts signaled the pilots to start their engines, and the air was suddenly filled with the deafening, bone-shaking roar of General Electric 414 turbofans. The first 2 FA-18 Super Hornets were taxied onto catapults 1 and 2. The pilots went through their final checks with practiced, mechanical precision, their eyes scanning the green glow of the multifunction displays. The smell of burnt jet fuel and salt spray hung heavy over the flight deck. With a sudden, violent hiss of steam and a jolt that compressed the pilot's spines, the first fighter was flung into the air, accelerating from 0 to 250 kilometers per hour in under 3 seconds. 2 F-35 Bravo Lightning fighters followed shortly after, their stealth coatings shimmering under the deck lights as they disappeared into the gray morning mist. By 5:30 in the morning, the United States Navy had 12 fighters in the air, forming a defensive screen 50 miles ahead of the carrier. The commanding officer of the strike group, operating from the bridge of the USS Abraham Lincoln, received the first digitized imagery from the Hawkeye. The J-20 formation had split into 3 separate cells. One cell was staying high, likely acting as a radar-silent ambush force, while the other 2 dropped to low altitude to hide against the clutter of the sea surface. The tactical data link hummed with encrypted information, sharing target coordinates and fuel states between the Super Hornets and the Lightning fighters. At coordinates 15 degrees 20 minutes north, 118 degrees 10 minutes east, the lead FA-18 pilot toggled his master arm switch to the on position. He could see nothing through the canopy, but a wall of gray clouds and the occasional flash of whitecaps on the canned water below. But on his heads-up display, a red diamond was pulsing. The enemy was 120 kilometers away and closing fast. The rules of engagement were clear but restrictive. They were not to fire unless fired upon or unless the enemy demonstrated clear hostile intent by illuminating the strike group with fire control radar. That intent was confirmed at 5:35 in the morning. Every cockpit in the U.S. formation erupted with the frantic chirping of the radar warning receivers. The J-20 fighters had transitioned from passive searching to active target locking. The excess air, which had been silent just minutes before, was now thick with invisible electronic beams as both sides clawed for a firing solution. The engagement was no longer a possibility. It was a mathematical certainty. 5:36 in the morning. The lead FA-18 Super Hornet, call sign Ripper 1, banked hard to the left, its wings slicing through a thin layer of cirrus clouds at 35,000 feet. Behind the tinted visor of his flight helmet, the pilot watched a digital countdown on his heads-up display, the estimated time remaining, before the approaching J-20 stealth fighters crossed the final tactical threshold. The air inside the cockpit was pressurized and sterile, smelling of dry oxygen, and sterile, smelling of dry oxygen and the faint metallic tang of the electronics cooling system. Outside, the South China Sea was a vast obsidian mirror, reflecting a sky that was rapidly transitioning from the deep violet of night to the bruised orange of a tropical dawn. The horizon was sharp, a thin line where the atmosphere met the water, but the pilot's attention was locked on the glass cockpit displays. The tactical data link was flooded with information from the E-2 Delta Hawkeye, painting a picture of an enemy that was no longer interested in posturing. The rules of engagement for the 7th Fleet were precise, designed to prevent an accidental escalation while ensuring the survival of United States assets. For the last 3 minutes, the mission commander aboard the Hawkeye had been broadcasting a final warning on the International Air Distress Frequency. The message was delivered in clear English and Mandarin, stating that the unidentified aircraft were approaching a United States Navy carrier strike group on a hostile vector and must turn away immediately or face defensive action. There was no verbal response from the Chinese formation. Instead, the J-20 fighters responded with a physical demonstration of intent. The 14 radar tracks on the Hawkeye's screen began to accelerate, their speed jumping from 900 kilometers per hour to Mach 1.4 in a matter of seconds. They were no longer cruising. They were lighting the candles, using their afterburners to reach intercept speeds. At the same time, the enemy aircraft began to execute a series of high-G defensive maneuvers, weaving in and out of the cloud deck to complicate the United States radar locks. On the bridge of the USS Abraham Lincoln, the atmosphere was one of cold, professional intensity. Admiral Marcus Vance stood at the center of the flag bridge, his eyes fixed on the large screen tactical display. He was surrounded by the low chatter of radio operators and the rhythmic chirping of automated defense systems. The decision to transition from monitoring to engaging was his alone, a weight that pressed down on the small room. At 5:38 in the morning, the lead J-20 fighter crossed the 100-kilometer mark from the outer screen of Super Hornets. This was the designated red line. If an armed, non-allied aircraft entered this circle while maintaining a lock on a United States vessel, it was classified as a hostile act. The admiral leaned forward, his voice calm and level. He gave the order that would change the course of the decade. Vanguard, this is Lincoln. You are cleared to engage. Weapons free for all targets within the red line. Protect the strike group. The command was relayed instantly through the encrypted satellite link to the 12 pilots in the air. In the cockpit of Ripper 1, the pilot heard the tone change in his headset, a sharp, staccato pulse that indicated his onboard computer had authorized the release of ordnance. He reached out with his gloved thumb and flipped the master arm switch to the arm position. On his screen, the symbols for his 4 AIM-120 advanced medium-range air-to-air missiles turned from white to a steady, predatory red. The pilot felt a surge of adrenaline, but it was tempered by years of repetitive training. He adjusted his grip on the stick, feeling the subtle vibrations of the airframe as it pushed through the thickening air. The Super Hornet was a heavy, powerful machine, and at these speeds, every movement felt deliberate and consequential. He looked to his left and saw his wingman, Ripper 2, holding a tight formation just 500 meters away. The two jets were a single unit, a pair of apex predators preparing to strike. The West, the J-20 pilots were doing the same. They had been trained for this specific moment, the chance to prove their fifth-generation technology against the established power of the United States Navy. Their cockpits were filled with the green glow of large format displays, showing the American fighters as a series of blinking icons. They knew they had the advantage in raw speed and stealth, but they also knew that the American pilots were backed by the most sophisticated electronic warfare network in the world. The engagement was now a matter of physics and reaction times. The closing speed between the two formations was over 3,000 kilometers per hour. At coordinates 15 degrees, 24 minutes north, 118 degrees, 5 minutes east, the first pilot in the American formation squeezed the trigger on the back of his flight stick. The silence of the high-altitude atmosphere was about to be shattered by the sound of solid-fuel rocket motors. The transition from a cold war of sensors to a hot war of kinetic energy was complete. The mission had changed. It was no longer about presence or diplomacy. It was about survival in a sky that was about to be filled with fire. 5:39 in the morning, 40,000 feet above the South China Sea. The first volley of 24 AIM-120 advanced medium-range air-to-air missiles detached from the underwing pylons of the American fighters. The physical release was felt by every pilot as a sharp upward jolt of the airframe, followed immediately by the bone-shaking roar of solid-fuel rocket motors igniting just feet from the cockpit. The white-hot exhaust of the missiles cut through the freezing, thin air, leaving 24 distinct white scars across the deep blue of the upper atmosphere. In the cockpit of Ripper 1, the pilot watched his tactical display as the missiles transitioned from the carrier's guidance to their own internal active radar seekers. The smell of ozone and recycled air was sharp in his mask as he performed a sharp, high-G bank to the right, beginning the tactical maneuver known as the crank. The American strategy was a disciplined exercise in physics and electronic deception. By turning 60 degrees away from the target while maintaining a radar lock at the edge of the sensor's gimbal, the pilots forced the incoming enemy missiles to fly a longer, more curved path, draining their kinetic energy. Simultaneously, the two EA-18 Golf Growler electronic warfare aircraft, operating 10 miles behind the main screen, activated their AN/ALQ-218 jamming pods. The air was suddenly flooded with high-powered electromagnetic noise, designed to blind the seeker heads of the Chinese weapons and hide the exact position of the American fighters within a cloud of digital ghosts. The Chinese formation countered with its own sophisticated long-range strike. The internal weapons bays of the 14 J-20 stealth fighters cycled open for less than 2 seconds, long enough to ripple-fire 28 PL-15 long-range air-to-air missiles. These weapons, powered by dual-pulse rocket motors, accelerated toward Mach 4.5, climbing to 50,000 feet, to gain a gravitational advantage before diving onto their targets. The sky between the two formations was no longer empty. It was a complex lattice of supersonic projectiles, each searching for a heat signature or a radar return. Inside the Combat Direction Center of the USS Abraham Lincoln, the tactical action officer tracked the engagement on the large-screen Aegis display. The room was bathed in a low blue light. The only sound the steady, rhythmic chirping of the ANSPY-6 radar and the quiet, urgent reports from the radio operators. The American fleet was now operating under a mission-controlled delta, meaning almost all radio communications were silenced to prevent the enemy from homing in on the carrier's location. Information was shared instead through the narrow-beam, low-probability of intercept data link, a digital, invisible thread connecting every ship and aircraft in the strike group. The first exchange was a testament to the effectiveness of modern electronic countermeasures. As the 28 Chinese missiles entered their terminal phase, the American pilots deployed bundles of chaff, thousands of tiny strips of aluminum-coated glass fiber, and magnesium flares. The sky erupted in a series of brilliant white flashes that bleached the morning light. The seeker heads of many of the PL-15 missiles, confused by the jamming from the Growlers and the physical decoys, lost their locks and spiraled harmlessly into the sea. Of the initial 28 missiles, 24 missed their marks entirely, detonating against empty air or diving into the waves. However, the Chinese J-20 fighters were not easily deterred. Using their advanced infrared search and track systems, which did not require radar and were immune to jamming, The Chinese pilots identified the heat signatures of the Super Hornet engines. They redirected their remaining missiles with mid-course updates. At 5:42 in the morning, the first casualty of the engagement occurred. A PL-15 missile, having ignored the chaff clouds, proximity fused 10 meters from the tail of an FA-18 Super Hornet, callsign Ripper 4. The explosion was a sudden, violent sphere of orange flame and jagged titanium shrapnel that shredded the fighter's right horizontal stabilizer and punctured the fuel cells. The aircraft did not disintegrate instantly, but it began a violent, unrecoverable roll to the right. The pilot, fighting against 6 Gs of centrifugal force, managed to reach the ejection handle. A split second later, the canopy shattered and the Martin Baker ejection seat fired, punching him into the freezing slipstream. The multi-million-dollar fighter turned into a tumbling torch, trailing a long plume of black smoke as it began its 4-mile descent toward the water below. The American volley was equally lethal. Despite the stealth characteristics of the J-20, the sheer volume of the AIM-120 missiles, and the precision of the E-2 Delta Hawkeye's guidance meant that the Chinese formation could not escape unscathed. 2 J-20 fighters, caught at the edge of their defensive maneuvers, were struck. One disintegrated in a massive secondary explosion as the missile hit the internal weapons bay, while the other lost its entire port side engine and began a steep, spiraling dive. The long-range exchange had lasted exactly 4 minutes. 3 aircraft were already gone, and the remaining fighters were now closing the distance at a combined speed of over 2,000 kilometers per hour. The digital duel of sensors and long-range missiles was over. The battle was moving into the merge, where technology would be forced to compete with the raw skill and split-second reactions of the pilots in a visual-range dogfight. 5:43 in the morning. The South China Sea, at coordinates 15 degrees, 28 minutes north, 117 degrees, 55 minutes east. The remaining 10 American fighters and 12 Chinese J-20 stealth jets shattered the sound barrier as they closed the final 20 kilometers of airspace. The sky, now a pale and translucent blue, was crisscrossed by the lingering white exhaust trails of the long-range missile exchange. Inside the cockpits, the pilots were no longer staring exclusively at their radar screens. They were straining their necks, searching for the glint of sunlight on a canopy, or the dark, razor-thin silhouette of an enemy wing. The air was heavy with the physical weight of 9 times the force of gravity, as the formations fractured into individual pairs. A chaotic scramble known to the pilots as the furball. The F-35 Bravo Lightning fighters, leveraging their advanced sensor fusion, were the first to acquire visual targets in the shimmering heat haze. Their pilots used helmet-mounted display systems, which allowed them to look directly through the floor of their own aircraft to track enemy movements below. The smell of recycled oxygen and the salt-crusted rubber of the flight masks was the only reality for the men strapped into their seats. Every muscle was tensed, and every breath was a shallow, controlled effort against the crushing pressure of the G-suits. The digital world of long-range sensors had been replaced by the raw, kinetic reality of a visual dogfight. The transition was violent and immediate. As the two forces merged, the American pilots executed a series of high-alpha maneuvers, pulling the noses of their aircraft toward the sky, to bleed off speed and force the faster Chinese jets to overshot. The scream of the engines reached a frantic, glass-shattering pitch, as afterburners were engaged and disengaged in a desperate dance for position. The white-hot glare of the sun, rising higher over the horizon, became a tactical tool used by both sides to blind their opponents during a pursuit. The J-20 pilots proved to be aggressive and highly testing, trained, utilizing the superior turn rate of their canard-winged aircraft to snap their noses around for snapshots. At 5:45 in the morning, the first short-range infrared missiles were cleared for launch. These were the AIM-9X Sidewinder and the Chinese PL-10, weapons designed for high off-bore sight engagements. These missiles did not require the pilot to be directly behind the target. They only required the pilot to look at the enemy. The seeker heads, chilled by internal cryogenics, locked onto the searing heat of the engine nozzles with terrifying speed. In the center of the fray, a pair of FA-18 Super Hornets from the USS Abraham Lincoln found themselves bracketed by 4 Chinese fighters. The American-led pilot, callsign Ripper 1, banked his fighter until he was flying inverted, looking down at the ocean 4 miles below. He could see the whitecaps on the water and the dark, churning wake of a Chinese destroyer. Far to the west, he felt the airframe shudder as he pushed the stick to the limit, the wingtip vapor trails snapping into existence, like white ribbons in the thin air. The sound of the wind screaming past his canopy was a constant, low-frequency roar that vibrated through his bones. The electronic environment had become a blinding fog. The EA-18 Golf Growlers, orbiting just outside the merge, were pumping out massive amounts of directed energy to disrupt the Chinese communication links. This forced the J-20 pilots to rely on their own internal sensors and visual cues, leveling the playing field against their superior numbers. On the carrier deck of the aircraft carrier, the flight deck crews worked in a feverish silence, moving the next wave of fighters toward the catapults. The smell of diesel and hot metal was thick on the wind as the ship turned hard into the swell to maintain launch operations. The fight was now a matter of seconds and inches. A single mistake in energy management, or a momentary lapse in situational awareness, meant a fireball in the sky. The pilots were operating at the very edge of human endurance, their vision narrowing as the blood was pulled from their brains by the violent maneuvers. They were no longer flying planes. They were components of a massive, lethal system that was consuming itself at 2,000 kilometers per hour. By 5:48 in the morning, the two formations were so tightly intertwined that the E-2 Delta Hawkeye could no longer distinguish friend from foe on its primary radar. The battle had become a private war between 22 men in the most advanced machines ever built. 5:49 in the morning. At coordinates 15 degrees 29 minutes north, 117 degrees 52 minutes east, the visual engagement reached its first lethal peak as the morning sun cleared the horizon, casting long, predatory shadows across the cockpit glass of the American fighters. The air was no longer a fluid medium. It was a dense, vibrating obstacle that the pilots fought with every ounce of their physical strength. In the cockpit of Ripper 1, the commander of the Strike Fighter Squadron felt the heavy, rhythmic thumping of his own heart against the restraint straps of his ejection seat. His vision was beginning to tunnel under the pressure of 9 Gs, but his thumb remained locked on the weapon release button. The tactical display showed a Chinese J-20 stealth fighter, designated Red Alpha, attempting to execute a vertical rolling scissors maneuver to get behind his wingman. The trigger was squeezed. The AIM-9X Sidewinder shrieked off the rail, a white column of fire punching backward through the smoke of the previous maneuvers. The heat blast washed across the fuselage of the Super Hornet, momentarily obscuring the pilot's view, with a dense cloud of chemical propellant. The sound of the launch was a high-frequency scream that cut through the roar of the engines, followed by a physical jolt that vibrated through the entire airframe. The Sidewinder, guided by its high off-boresight infrared seeker, ignored the desperate release of magnesium flares from the Chinese aircraft. The warhead punched through the portside engine intake of the J-20, detonating the internal fuel cells and the ready ammunition stored in the side weapons bay. The impact was instantaneous and catastrophic. The Chinese aircraft did not simply burn, it erupted into a jagged sphere of white and orange flame that bleached the sky of all other color for 3 full seconds. 5 tons of advanced composites and titanium were shredded into thousands of pieces, which were sent flying in every direction like lethal shrapnel. The Chinese wingman reacted with a violent, instinctive brake to the left, his airframe groaning under the stress of an over-G maneuver as he attempted to avoid the expanding debris field. He punched his afterburners to the limit, the twin tongues of blue-white flame extending 10 meters behind his aircraft as he dove toward the safety of the lower cloud deck. But the American F-35 Bravo, callsign Ghost 3, was already positioned in his blind spot. The pilot of the Lightning fighter used his helmet-mounted sight to slave a second Sidewinder to the target. The second missile left the internal bay of the F-35 with a dull metallic thud, its motor igniting 2 meters clear of the aircraft. It tracked the heat signature of the Chinese afterburner with unerring precision. The explosion severed the tail section of the J-20, sending the main fuselage into an uncontrollable, high-speed flat spin. The Chinese pilot, seeing the ocean rushing toward him at 1,000 kilometers per hour, pulled his ejection handles. The rocket motor of his seat fired, punching him into the thin air. Just as the remains of his fighter slammed into the surface of the South China Sea, creating a massive white plume of water and burning oil. Black smoke rose from the two wreckage sites, hanging in the still morning air as a grim marker of the engagement's cost. The radio channels of the Chinese formation, which had been silent for the first phase of the battle, erupted in a chaotic overlap of voices, each one louder than the last. The discipline of the intercepting force began to fracture, as they realized their technological edge had been countered by superior American tactical coordination. The smell of burning rubber and ozone filled the cockpit of Ripper 1 as he leveled his wings, his eyes scanning the horizon for the next threat. The immediate aftermath of the first two kills left a temporary vacuum in the center of the furball. For exactly 6 seconds, there was a dead silence on the tactical frequency as every pilot recalculated their position, but the respite was short-lived. To the north, another cell of 4 J-20 fighters was closing at supersonic speeds, their radars now fully active and locked onto the American screen. The first 5 minutes of the visual engagement had cost the Chinese 2 aircraft, but the United States Navy was about to pay its own price for holding the line. The third casualty of the morning occurred at 5:51. A Chinese PL-10 missile, fired from a high deflection angle, struck the underside of an FA-18 Super Hornet. The blast wave threw the fighter onto its back, the pressure compressing the pilot's chest so violently that he could not draw breath to call out his status. The aircraft lost all electrical power and began a heavy, unpowered descent toward the waves. By the time the 15-minute mark approached, 3 aircraft had been destroyed and 1 was crippled, leaving the sky. Over the South China Sea, a graveyard of burning metal and shattered plans. 5:57 in the morning. The defensive perimeter of the USS Abraham Lincoln, 40 miles north of the carrier. The remaining 6 FA-18 Super Hornets of Strike Fighter Squadron 147 tightened their formation, executing a high-speed defensive circle known as a combat air patrol. The air at 20,000 feet was a hazy mix of morning humidity and the lingering gray streaks of spent solid fuel rocket motors. Below them, the South China Sea had turned from obsidian to a deep, bruised purple as the sun climbed higher. The pilots could feel the constant, low-frequency vibration of their engines through their flight suits, a reminder that their fuel states were dropping toward bingo levels, the point where they would have just enough fuel to return to the ship. The tactical situation had entered its most dangerous phase. While the first wave of Chinese fighters had been thinned, the E-2 Delta Hawkeye was now tracking a second, larger formation of 16 aircraft approaching from the northwest. These were a mix of J-20 stealth fighters and J-16 multi-role jets, the latter carrying heavy loads of anti-ship cruise missiles. At the same time, the 2 HQ-9 surface-to-air missiles launched from the Chinese destroyer were closing in on the EA-18 Gulf Growlers at Mach 4. The crew of Raven 2, the second Growler, watched their electronic warfare display as the 2 incoming missiles entered their terminal homing phase. The pilot banked the heavy jet into a violent descending spiral, pushing the airframe to its structural limit of 7.5 Gs. The electronic warfare officer fired off a final, massive burst of deceptive jamming, attempting to create a digital break in the missile's radar lock. The sound of the wind screaming past the cockpit was like a physical weight, drowning out the frantic audio warnings in their headsets. The first HQ-9 missile was successfully baited by a towed decoy, detonating 500 meters behind the aircraft in a spectacular but harmless cloud of fire and smoke. However, the second missile proved more resilient. It ignored the electronic noise and corrected its flight path with a series of high-speed thruster pulses. The trigger was squeezed by a computer 300 miles away, and the logic of the engagement reached its conclusion. The 15-kilogram warhead, of the HQ-9 detonated exactly 4 meters from the Growler's left wing root. The impact was not a single sound, but a series of overlapping mechanical failures as thousands of tungsten pellets punched through the aluminum skin and severed the hydraulic lines. The left wing was instantly stripped of its control surfaces, and the jet was thrown into a violent, high-speed yaw that the pilot could not correct. The fuel in the wing tanks ignited, creating a brilliant white and orange fireball that illuminated the gray clouds like a second sun. Both the pilot and the electronic warfare officer were forced to eject as the crippled aircraft broke apart into 3 distinct burning sections that tumbled toward the ocean. The loss of Raven 2 created a hole in the American electronic shield. Seizing the opportunity, the lead Chinese J-20 pilot in the second wave fired a PL-15 missile at an F-35 Bravo, callsign Ghost 4. The American pilot, momentarily blinded by the glare of the morning sun and the loss of shared radar data from the fallen Growler, did not see the missile until it was 3 kilometers away. He attempted a desperate brake maneuver, pulling the nose of his jet vertical while deploying a massive screen of flares. The Chinese missile ignored the decoys and drove straight into the belly of the F-35. The warhead punched through the stealth coating and detonated inside the internal lift fan bay. The explosion was so powerful that it blew the cockpit canopy clean off the aircraft, followed by a secondary detonation that consumed the entire forward fuselage. There was no ejection. The $500 million fighter simply vanished inside a cloud of black smoke and glittering titanium debris. At coordinates 15 degrees 32 minutes north, 117 degrees 48 minutes east, the engagement had turned into a desperate war of attrition. The American screen had been reduced to 8 functional aircraft, while the Chinese were pressing their numerical advantage with a fresh wave of 24 missiles. The smell of hot metal and burnt oil seemed to permeate the very atmosphere, carried on a wind that was now thick with the debris of 7 destroyed aircraft. On the bridge of the USS Abraham Lincoln, Admiral Vance watched the 2 blue icons disappear from the tactical display. The room was silent, the only sound, the steady, mechanical clicking of the Aegis fire control computers as they prepared the ship's own rolling airframe missiles for defense. The 15-minute window was rapidly closing, and the tally of lost airframes was climbing. The professional discipline of the United States Navy was being tested by the raw, kinetic reality of a peer-to-peer conflict where every move was answered with fire. 5:59 in the morning, the 15-minute mark of the engagement, at coordinates 15 degrees 34 minutes north, 117 degrees 45 minutes east. The sky above the South China Sea had become a high-speed slaughterhouse. The digital precision of the opening minutes had dissolved into a primitive, screaming struggle for survival as the remaining fighters of both nations collided in the final, most violent exchange of the morning. The air was a thick soup of gray smoke, white chemical trails, and the jagged, glittering fragments of 10 aircraft already claimed by the sea. The sound was a continuous, overlapping roar of turbofans and the sharp, whip-crack reports of supersonic passes that rattled the teeth of every pilot in the air. In the center of the chaos, the lead FA-18 Super Hornet, Ripper 1, found himself in a high-speed descending spiral with a foreign military stealth fighter. The 2 jets were moving at Mach 1.2, their airframes groaning under the massive stress of the turn. The American pilot's vision was a narrowing tunnel of gray as he pulled the stick into his lap, the G-suit inflating around his legs with a sharp hiss to keep the blood in his brain. The smell of his own sweat was thick inside his mask. Mixing with the metallic tang of high-pressure oxygen, the foreign pilot made the first move. The internal bay of the stealth fighter cycled open, and a short-range missile shrieked off the rail. The white column of fire punched backward through the thin air, the heat blast washing across the fighter's fuselage with a searing intensity. The missile tracked the heat of the engines with a predatory, flickering logic. The American pilot kicked the rudder hard left and punched a massive cloud of magnesium flares, the brilliant white light bleaching the sky for a fraction of a second. The missile, confused by the sudden bloom of thermal energy, detonated 10 meters shy of the tail. The shock wave from the 50-pound warhead slammed into the fighter like a physical blow from a sledgehammer. The blast wave threw the aircraft onto its side, the pressure compressing the pilot's chest so hard he felt his ribs flex. The sound of the detonation was a bone-shattering crack that bypassed his helmet entirely. Shrapnel shredded the right engine casing, and a secondary fireball erupted instantly as the high-pressure fuel lines were severed. The jet began a violent, unrecoverable roll, the right wing shedding its control surfaces as the airframe came apart under the aerodynamic load. Ripper 1 was gone, the 11th aircraft lost, his ejection seat firing into a sky filled with black smoke. Ripper 2, the wingman, did not hesitate. His thumb moved to the gun's select on his stick, activating the M61 A2 Vulcan cannon. He wrenched the nose of his fighter toward the enemy jet as it leveled off from its kill. The 20mm armor-piercing rounds tore through the air at a rate of 6,000 rounds per minute. The stream of fire was a visible line of tracer light that punched straight through the foreign fighter's canopy into the cockpit. The impact shattered the reinforced glass into a million diamonds and sent the pilot's seat flying into the slipstream in a spray of red and gray. The stealth fighter's nose pitched down violently, the flight computers unable to compensate for the loss of the pilot. The 12-ton stealth fighter fell straight down, a dead weight that slammed into the surface of the ocean 2 seconds later. The tally was complete. 12 fighters, 6 American and 6 Chinese, had been destroyed in exactly 15 minutes. The sky, which had been a theater of state-of-the-art technology, was now a graveyard of burning oil and drifting debris. The remaining 4 Chinese aircraft, their mission accomplished and their fuel low, broke contact and dove toward the west, disappearing into the morning haze. The 4 surviving American jets, 3 Super Hornets and 1 Lightning, leveled their wings in a stunned, heavy silence. The heat of the explosions still lingered in the air, a chemical bite that fouled the morning breeze. Black smoke rose in pillars from the various crash sites, marking the points where millions of dollars and years of training had been extinguished in a matter of heartbeats. The radio channels were suddenly eerily quiet. The only sound, the heavy, ragged breathing of the surviving pilots as they checked their fuel gauges and turned their battered aircraft back toward the east. The carrier strike group was safe, but the cost was a scar that would never heal. 6:05 in the morning. The South China Sea, at coordinates 15 degrees 28 minutes north, 117 degrees 42 minutes east. The roar of the afterburners had been replaced by a heavy, haunting silence, broken only by the rhythmic, low-frequency thrumming of 2 MH-60 Sierra Seahawk helicopters. The aircraft, call signs Rescue 1 and Rescue 2, were skimming just 50 feet above the water, their rotors kicking up a fine, salty mist that coated the cockpit glass. The crews were operating under a state of extreme urgency. 12 aircraft had been destroyed in the last 15 minutes, and while the radar screens were currently clear of enemy fighters, the window for a successful recovery was closing. The Chinese Type 054 Alpha frigate, located only 30 miles to the west, was already steaming toward the crash site at 30 knots. The ocean surface was a graveyard of industrial debris. Patches of iridescent jet fuel spread across the swells like oil paintings, dampening the whitecaps. The smell was overpowering, a thick, chemical cocktail of burnt kerosene, scorched carbon fiber, and the sharp, briny tang of the sea. Scattered across a 5-mile radius were the orange and white canopies of parachutes, some draped for the pilots bobbing in the water. The transition from the high-G environment of a 5th-generation cockpit to the isolation of a life raft had been a violent, disorienting shock. In the back of Rescue 1, the search and rescue swimmer sat by the open cabin door, his legs dangling over the edge. He was dressed in a full neoprene suit, fins, and a mask, his eyes scanning the water for the bright green glow of sea dye markers. The wind from the rotor wash whipped against his face, carrying the heat of the helicopter's twin engines. He spotted a flash of movement, a handheld strobe light pulsing rhythmically against the dark water. It was the pilot of Ripper 1, the squadron commander who had been shot down only minutes before. The helicopter flared, its nose pitching up to bleed off airspeed as it hovered directly over the survivor. The downwash from the rotors flattened the waves into a white, churning circle of spray. The swimmer did not wait for the hoist. He rolled out of the door, hitting the water with a clean splash and swimming toward the pilot. The survivor was tangled in his parachute shrouds, his face pale and smeared with soot from the explosion. The recovery was a delicate, physical struggle. The swimmer worked to cut the lines with a specialized knife, while the helicopter hovered precariously, its flight computers fighting the shifting winds. 30 meters away, Rescue 2 was engaging in a similar race against time. They had located 2 more survivors, 1 American and 1 Chinese pilot, clinging to the same piece of floating fuselage from a destroyed J-20. The tactical situation remained fluid and dangerous. The E-2 Delta Hawkeye, still orbiting at 30,000 feet, broadcast a warning. A Chinese Z-9 helicopter had just launched from the frigate to the west. The rescue was no longer just a humanitarian mission. It was a race for intelligence and personnel that could be captured by the enemy. The American rescue swimmer reached the 2 men and prioritized the American pilot, hooking him into the rescue basket. As the winch began to grind, lifting the dripping survivor toward the cabin, the Chinese pilot watched in a state of exhaustion and shock. The American crew had orders to recover all survivors regardless of nationality, but the arrival of the Chinese helicopter forced a split-second decision. The MH-60 Sierra dipped its nose, its door gunner swiveling his M240 machine gun toward the horizon, not to fire, but to signal a defensive posture as the second rescue was initiated. By 6:15 in the morning, 5 survivors had been pulled from the water, 3 Americans and 2 Chinese. The physical state of the men was grim. They were suffering from compression fractures, flash burns, and severe hypothermia. Inside the cramped, vibrating cabins of the helicopters, the corpsmen worked with practiced efficiency, cutting away flight suits and administering intravenous fluids. The smell of salt water and sweat filled the small space, a stark contrast to the sterile, high-tech environments the pilots had occupied only 20 minutes earlier. The 2 Seahawks turned back toward the east, accelerating to their maximum speed of 180 knots. Behind them, the Chinese Z-9 helicopter arrived at the scene to recover the remaining 3 survivors who had drifted further west. The battlefield was being cleared, not by diplomats, but by the crews who lived and died by the luck of the search. The 12 lost aircraft were now nothing more than sonar anomalies on the seafloor. But for the men in the back of the Seahawks, the war had become a very personal struggle for the next breath of air. 6:20 in the morning. The flight deck of the USS Abraham Lincoln. The massive 4.5-acre steel deck was a scene of industrial fury as the carrier turned hard into a 30-knot headwind to facilitate emergency recovery and launch operations. The air was thick with the suffocating smell of JP-5 jet fuel, hot hydraulic fluid, and the sharp, metallic tang of overheated carbon fiber brakes. Underneath the heavy boots of the sailors, the deck plate vibrated with the power of 4 nuclear reactors, pushing 100,000 tons of United States sovereign territory through the choppy swells of the South China Sea. The morning humidity clung to the colorful jerseys of the flight deck crew, turning their sweat into a slick layer that mixed with the grime of a combat turnaround. Yellow-shirted aircraft directors moved with a frantic, rhythmic grace, their hand signals illuminated by the glow of orange wands. They were taxiing the remaining FA-18 Super Hornets and F-35 Charlie Lightning fighters into the pit, a designated area for rapid refueling and rearming. On the starboard side, near catapult number 1, a Super Hornet sat with its canopy open, the pilot leaning forward and staring at the deck, his hands shaking from the adrenaline dump of the last 20 minutes. Beside the aircraft, red-shirted ordnancemen worked in teams of 4, manhandling heavy carts loaded with AIM-120 Delta missiles and AIM-9X sidewinders. They were stripping the safety pins and prepping the weapons with a speed born of desperation. The silence that had followed the shootdowns was gone, replaced by the mechanical shriek of the JBD, or jet blast deflector, as it rose from the deck to protect the crew from the searing exhaust of the next departing aircraft. The sound was a physical weight, a low-frequency rumble that could be felt in the marrow of the sailors' bones. Every 30 seconds, the hiss of high-pressure steam escaped from the catapult tracks, obscuring the deck in a ghostly white fog that smelled of sulfur and wet iron. In the primary flight control tower, known as Pry-Fly, the air boss watched the deck through thick, reinforced glass. His voice was a constant, level stream of commands over the flight deck circuit, coordinating the movement of 60 aircraft and over 400 personnel. The tactical situation had shifted from an aerial dogfight to a race against time. The E-2 Delta Hawkeye had just updated the threat board. 3 DF-21 Delta anti-ship ballistic missiles had been detected launching from a coastal site on the foreign military mainland. These weapons, known as carrier killers, were currently screaming through the upper atmosphere at Mach 10, guided by the very same satellite links the American fleet was struggling to jam. The ship's defensive posture shifted to point defense. On the edges of the flight deck, the Mark 15 Phalanx close-in weapon systems began their automated search patterns, the white, dome-shaped radar housings slewing left and right with robotic precision. Nearby, the Mark 29 Evolved Sea Sparrow missile launchers angled toward the northwest, their canisters loaded with interceptors designed to shred incoming missiles in the final seconds of their flight. The sailors on deck knew the math. They had less than 8 minutes before the first ballistic warheads reached the carrier strike group's outer defensive ring. Despite the looming missile threat, the work on the flight deck did not slow down. A second wave of 12 Super Hornets was being readied to take the place of the lost aircraft. Maintenance crews in green jerseys scrambled over the fuselages, checking for shrapnel damage and topping off engine oil. The electronic warfare technicians were already swapping out the jamming pods on a damaged EA-18 Golf Growler, their movements mechanical and precise. The smell of hot metal and grease was a constant presence, a sensory reminder of the thin line between a functioning warship and a burning wreck. At 6:28 in the morning, at coordinates 15 degrees 35 minutes north, 118 degrees 5 minutes east, the USS Abraham Lincoln began its defensive maneuvers. The ship tilted 15 degrees to the port side as it executed a high-speed turn. The wake behind the carrier, a mile-long white scar on the blue water. The sirens for general quarters began to wail throughout the ship, a deep, rhythmic sound that signaled every sailor to don their flash gear and brace for impact. On the flight deck, the last FA-18 was hooked into the catapult shuttle. The pilot looked toward the yellow shirt, gave a crisp salute, and braced his head against the seat. The deck shuddered as the catapult fired, flinging the fighter into the Seine. Hazy morning air. The roar of the afterburner was a final, defiant scream against the silence of the sea. As the jet disappeared into the clouds, the flight deck crew dropped to one knee, a collective gesture of bracing for what was coming next. The battle in the air was over, but the battle for the ship was just beginning. The South China Sea, once a corridor of trade, had become a funnel of fire, and the USS Abraham Lincoln was sitting at the very center of the target. 6:45 in the morning, the Carrier Intelligence Center aboard the USS Abraham Lincoln. The room was a cold, windowless vault of blue light and low-frequency humming. The air was kept at exactly 18 degrees Celsius to protect the massive server banks, and it smelled faintly of static electricity, floor wax, and the bitter dregs of several dozen cups of black coffee. On the main tactical bulkhead, the battle was no longer a collection of screaming engines and fireballs. It had been reduced to a sterile, high-resolution spreadsheet. The Battle Damage Assessment Cell, a team of 20 intelligence officers and imagery analysts, was finalizing the tactical tally of the engagement that had occurred exactly 1 hour ago. The commanding officer of the air wing stood at the center of the room, his eyes scanning the data. The report was categorized by airframe, ordnance type, and personnel status. It was a professional, bloodless summary of 15 minutes of absolute chaos. The United States Navy had suffered its most significant loss of tactical aircraft in a single engagement since a major historical conflict. 6 airframes were confirmed, destroyed, or lost at sea. The first loss, at 5:42 in the morning, was an FA-18 Super Hornet, call sign Ripper 4. The damage was recorded as a proximity fuse detonation from a foreign military missile. The analysis of the flight data recorder, transmitted in the seconds before impact, showed that 30,000 tungsten pellets had shredded dead the right horizontal stabilizer and punctured the primary fuel cells. The pilot had successfully ejected and was currently in the carrier's medical ward undergoing treatment for a fractured femur. The second and third losses were more catastrophic. An F-35 Bravo Lightning fighter, call sign Ghost 4, had taken a direct hit to the internal lift fan bay at 5:58. The intelligence report noted that the composite stealth skin had actually contained the initial blast, causing the pressure to vent internally and triggering a secondary detonation of the missiles still held in the weapons bay. The aircraft had disintegrated instantly at 25,000 feet. The pilot was listed as killed in action, the only American fatality of the flight deck crew's first wave recovery. The fourth loss was the EA-18 Gulf Growler Raven II. The tactical tally confirmed the aircraft had been targeted by a modified surface-to-air missile. The weapons seeker had locked onto the Growler's high-powered jamming emissions, detonating at the wing root. The damage was described as total hydraulic failure and structural separation of the port wing. Both the pilot and the electronic warfare officer had been recovered by the MH-60 Sierra helicopters, suffering from severe flash burns but expected to make a full recovery. The final 2 American losses were FA-18 Super Hornets, including the squadron commander's aircraft, Ripper 1. Both had been lost during the high-G visual engagement between 5:59 and 6:01. One had suffered an unrecoverable engine fire after a missile strike, while the other had been crippled by heavy shrapnel, damage that severed the fly-by-wire control linkages. Both pilots were recovered during the 6:05 rescue window. The Chinese tally was equally severe, documented through the gun camera footage and sensor logs of the surviving American fighters. 6 foreign military stealth fighters were confirmed as kills. One had been obliterated by an AIM-9X Sidewinder, resulting in a total airframe vaporization. 2 others had been downed by missiles during the long-range exchange. Their remains scattered across a 10-mile debris field. A 4th foreign stealth fighter had been destroyed by 20mm Vulcan cannon fire, a rare and violent result of a close-in merge where the pilot had shredded the enemy cockpit. The 5th and 6th foreign military losses were attributed to a combination of missile damage and tactical errors during high-speed maneuvers. One stealth jet had entered an unrecoverable flat spin after its tail section was severed by a missile, while the last was seen trailing fire and losing altitude rapidly, before disappearing from radar. Of the 6 foreign pilots, 2 were currently in American custody aboard the aircraft carrier. 2 had been recovered by the foreign frigate to the west, and 2 were officially listed as missing at sea. The tactical analysis concluded that the parity in losses was a result of the extreme density of the engagement. At ranges of less than 15 kilometers, the technological advantages of stealth and long-range sensors were neutralized by the sheer volume of infrared missiles and the rapid-fire nature of the dogfight. The report noted that the military forces had achieved its objective of protecting the carrier, but the cost was 60% of the Ready 5 alert force. The commander closed the digital folder. The smell of the cold, recycled air seemed sharper now, more sterile. The 12 lost aircraft represented over $1 billion in hardware and decades of collective combat experience, all consumed in a quarter of an hour. The tally was done, the numbers were verified, and the names of the fallen were being prepared for the official casualty notification. The room remained silent as the analysts turned back to their screens, already beginning the work of tracking the next wave of threats appearing on the horizon. 7:15 in the morning. The South China Sea, 90 miles east of the initial engagement zone. The USS Abraham Lincoln maintained a steady course of 090, steaming at 32 knots toward the deeper, more open waters of the Philippine Sea. The carrier strike group had successfully repelled the immediate aerial threat and transitioned into a high-readiness defensive posture to counter the looming anti-ship ballistic missile launch. The 3 incoming Chinese missiles, detected earlier by the Aegis radar system, had been successfully intercepted by the destroyer USS Mason and the cruiser USS Chancellorsville, their SM-3 Block II Alpha interceptors, obliterating the warheads in the cold vacuum of the upper atmosphere. The sky above the fleet was now clear of hostile tracks, but the atmosphere on the bridge remained one of heavy, focused, professional silence. The geopolitical fallout was already beginning to radiate from the coordinates of the conflict. In Washington and Beijing, the direct military hotlines were finally active after 90 minutes of silence. The narrative was being shaped not by the pilots in the cockpits, but by the diplomats and commanders who had to decide if 12 downed aircraft were the end of a skirmish or the beginning of a global catastrophe. The South China Sea, usually a cacophony of maritime traffic and radio chatter, had fallen into a strange, artificial quiet as commercial shipping lanes were diverted by regional authorities. On the flight deck of the USS Abraham Lincoln, the second wave of 12 FA-18 Super Hornets returned from their defensive orbits. They did not return to the celebratory cheers of a victorious crew, but to the methodical, grim efficiency of a recovery operation that knew exactly what had been lost. The smell of hot brakes and scorched carrier deck non-skid coating was still sharp in the air. As the last jet caught the number 3 arresting wire with a violent jerk, the LSO, or landing signal officer, closed his logbook. The carrier air wing was back on deck, but it was a wing that had been hollowed out by the loss of 6 primary combat aircraft and one of its most experienced squadron commanders. At 7:45 in the morning, the official after-action report was transmitted to Indo-Pacific Command in Hawaii. The strategic objective maintaining the freedom of navigation through the disputed corridor and protecting the carrier strike group had been achieved. The Chinese intercepting force had been forced to withdraw after suffering 50% losses of their initial engagement force. However, the report was blunt about the tactical reality of the encounter. The parity of the losses between the J-20 stealth fighters and the American carrier air wing proved that the era of uncontested American air superiority was over. The 15-minute engagement had demonstrated that in a high-density, peer-to-peer environment, technology was a consumable resource that could be spent in heartbeats. The human cost was being processed in the carrier's medical bay and the ready rooms. 5 pilots were undergoing treatment for various injuries, while the notification for the family of the pilot of Ghost 4 was being prepared. The 2 captured Chinese pilots were being held in a secure compartment, their presence a complicating factor in the ongoing diplomatic negotiations. The air of the ship was thick with the smell of floor wax and the low hum of the air conditioning, a mundane backdrop to the profound shift in the regional power balance that had just occurred. The South China Sea remained a bruised, dark blue under the rising sun. Below the surface, the wreckage of the 12 fighters was already settling into the silt, becoming part of the geography of a contested ocean. The oil slicks would eventually disperse, and the debris would be covered by the currents, but the data gathered during those 15 minutes would be studied for decades. The United States Navy had held the line, but the line had been drawn in the blood of its pilots and the shattered remains of its most advanced machines. The USS Abraham Lincoln continued its eastward transit. Her wake, a long, straight line of white water, reaching back toward the horizon. The ship was a fortress of steel and resolve, but she was also a reminder of the fragility of peace in a world where the speed of war is measured in Mach numbers and milliseconds. As the morning progressed, the flight deck crews began the slow, exhausting process of repairing the damaged aircraft and restocking the magazines. There was no victory parade, only the relentless, mechanical preparation for the next watch. The 15-minute war was over, but the long vigil of the 7th Fleet was just beginning.